All right, so up until now, we have been doing mostly, if not all, just statistical analysis or even just getting the foundations of statistical analysis. So we got to get into the research methods here. So this this talk will guide you through some of the very basics of the language used in experiments and a little bit of the history, since I find it's pretty interesting to look at the history of this work. And so we will do a little bit of that. So the language of the experiments is titled Vocabulary of Experiments, and I thought that was a nice title. I pulled it from the book by let's forward it again, by well, not Campbell and Stanley, but the updated version of that. So let me talk a little bit about this important work by Campbell and Stanley. It's titled Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Research, and it's a 1963 book. And the reason that this book is important is it's the first time that all of the experimental research methods in the social sciences and education were put into one place. And so it's really the original textbook in many ways. The Campbell and Stanley book was used to codify all of the designs that have been discussed in the social sciences up to that point. So the book that I'm relying on for this lecture is this. I have it right here, and it's an old book, let's just say, and it's still hanging together, and it smells wonderful. The book was updated in 2002 by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell, and it's really excellent for presenting all of the research designs and all of the issues. But it's a very tough read, so I am going to consolidate a lot of it and just give little pieces of it. But it's well worth the time to get a copy at some point if you are into experimentation. So where we have come in experimentation is a little interesting, I think. We have two really important books that happened before. There's quite a few actually before Campbell and Stanley, but there's two really important books. The first is less known. It's called How to Experiment in Education. It's a 1923 book, and it's fairly comprehensive. And then a book in 1925 by Ronald Fisher. So Fisher is an important figure in research design. The ANOVA, it was introduced by him, and the distribution, the F distribution after Fisher. So Fisher is important, and you'll be learning a little bit about Fisher in the future. So he wrote a book called Statistical Method for Research Workers. And the Campbell and Stanley prefer McCall, I think that's fair to say, or at least they say he's underrated, because McCall's book placed much more emphasis on the proper way to get the data and not as much on the statistical analysis. So if you think about research design as one, a proper way to get the data, and then statistical analysis is what to do with the data. Proper way to get the data, then what to do with the data. So Fisher, I think it's important to mention that his most significant contribution was random assignment. Up to that point, matching was the most popular way to achieve group equivalence. Also, for those of you who have had a course in undergrad on experimental design, you may recall something called the Latin square design. So Fisher was one to explain that in much more detail. Although we do know that method was used by Thorndike, another important figure in psychology, about 10 years earlier. So it was called the rotation design at that point. And we will learn about the Latin square design, and I'm sure you're very excited about that. So, so I think it's interesting at this point, there were only mostly single variable experiments at this point. And the idea of multivariable analysis wouldn't come along for a number of years. Fisher was one of the first to introduce multivariable analysis in the independent variable. So the dependent variable would not become possible until the late 50s. All right, so let's move into the definition of an experiment. And this is according to Schottish, Cook, and Campbell in the book Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Generalized Causal Inference. So an experiment is a study in which an intervention is deliberately introduced to observe its effects. A study in which an intervention is deliberately introduced to observe its effects. So we need to talk about some of the characteristics of an experiment. Experiments are things. So the first characteristic, these are in no particular order. There's three that are fairly widely cited, and then three that I added in, although they are, they could be used in quasi experiments or other kinds of research methods, but I think it's important at least to mention them. So the first characteristic is that it's based on measurement or observation. So each one of these areas, it could be an entire class in itself. And in fact, if you were to take a PhD in experimental psychology, you probably would have an entire class on measurement. You probably have multiple classes on measurement since it's so critical. You have the manipulation of conditions, and the manipulation of conditions is what Bacon called the twisting of the lion's tail. And Bacon was kind of an aggressive person. He was going to subject nature and all of those things. And then you have the control of extraneous variables. And this could be either statistical control, or it could be control by putting together a very tight experimental method. And so these controls are very important in order to reduce or isolate variables that could impact the interpretation of the results. And then here are a couple others that I've added in, that samples are used to estimate the population. So we don't sample the whole population, which is every single person in that population, like the population of all forensic psychologists in the world. We take a sample of them and estimate, which the word statistics means estimate. We have the results and interpretation are based on probability models. So this is where the p is less than 0.05 idea comes in. So the statistical significance. So we are trying to infer from the sample to the population. We are trying to infer that this is a real thing and not just a result of sampling error. So this is, I think, important to note. And then finally, the transparency of the process is at the heart of science, so that the results are presented and critiqued and reviewed and chewed over to make sure they're accurate. And this is where you get the idea of repeatability. So another more specified type of experiment is a randomized experiment. And this is an experiment in which units are assigned to receive the treatment or an alternative condition by a random process, such as tossing a coin or going through a computerized randomization process. The idea behind randomization is that randomization should be the best way to control for any kinds of extraneous variables. So it is arguably used to isolate the condition of intervention that we want to test. And then 3, we have a quasi-experiment, and this is when you don't use random assignment. You have a natural experiment, which is important to mention because natural experiments usually are not manipulated. In fact, are often things that just happen in history. And I think of landmark events like passing of certain laws. One of the studies that I was going to do at one point, but never got around to it, was to look at trauma associated with 9/11 based on proximity to ground zero. And so that would have been a really good study. I don't know if it's ever been done at this point, but we were going to look at online descriptions of it and try and follow up with people to create concentric circles for how close they were to ground zero. And then finally, a correlational study. And usually these are called exploratory studies or exploratory designs. And these are non-experimental because you're not manipulating anything. And in fact, you're unable to isolate cause. So that is a core feature of being an experiment. And so let's see, how long did that take? That took a little too long. I'm trying to get under 10 minutes, but that was 13 minutes. So we'll come back with some other goodies.